Morning, Facebook family. I'm Ben Hayes, the senior pastor of First Baptist Church, Dadeville, Alabama, and I'm coming to you again today with our daily devotion. This week I've been trying to provide you with some of the promises that God has made to us from His Word. And I've done it using a theme that is prevalent in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's the theme of God considering His children, His followers, to be like sheep in a flock. And today I want to share with you a passage that is very familiar to you. It's used all the time to bring comfort to families in times of grief. It's used to share the promises of God. And of course, you probably recognize already that I'm talking about the 23rd Psalm. I think that it is so familiar to us because it's full of the promises that God has made to His people. And I think if people need anything today, it's to hear these promises. But I want you to keep something in mind this morning and as the days go by. These promises are made by God to those who follow Him, to those who are His children. Now let me explain that with a little illustration. When my girls were growing up, if I promised to take them out for some ice cream, that didn't mean that I was going to buy ice cream for every child on my street or in my neighborhood or in my city. You see, there are some promises that God makes that are just for His children. Now, there are other promises that God makes that include everyone, like whosoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. He's made that promise to every one of us. But the promises that I'm sharing with you this week are for His children, His sheep. Now, that's the theme that I want to develop here. Yesterday, I talked about sheep as well, and I want to use these passages to show you some of God's promises. And the first thing that He does in the 23rd Psalm is that He promises to His sheep restoration. Now, I've talked to a lot of people over the last few weeks, and they're exhausted. They're exhausted physically. They're exhausted mentally. They're exhausted emotionally. Many are even exhausted spiritually. And in the first three verses of this psalm, David promises us that God restores His children when they find themselves at the end of their own resources. Look at what he says. In verse 1, he says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." That is physical restoration. Verse 2, he says, "He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters." That's emotional restoration. Verse 3, he says, "He restores my soul." That's spiritual restoration. And we need that in times like this because all of us have been stressed out over what's going on with this COVID-19 virus. We've all been worried about our friends and our neighbors and our loved ones, many of them who have been diagnosed with the virus, some who've gone through some horrible times. Everybody's concerned about their finances during these days. Everybody is stressed out in so many different ways. But here's the thing. God promises that for His sheep, He will provide the restoration that we need. I love the passage in Isaiah where God says to His people, "We will run and not be weary. We shall walk and not faint." And like little children, He will restore the strength that we need when we find ourselves in absolute weakness. The second promise that God makes in the 23rd Psalm is the promise of consolation. Look down at verse 4 in Psalm 23. David says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Why? Because God's with the shepherd. God is the shepherd. He's with the psalmist. And His presence is the greatest comfort that we will ever know. I got to tell you, I've lost my mom. I've lost my dad. I've lost my mother-in-law. Sonia and I have lost a couple of her siblings. I've lost hundreds of dear friends whose funerals I preached over the 38 years of ministry. And I made this statement in my message on Sunday, and I mean it. I believe it with all of my heart. Grief is one of the strongest emotions that human beings will ever experience. And I'll tell you that the only way that you can make it through the dark valley of the shadow of death is because God's presence will be with you. And I know that I've trusted in that in so many different ways, at so many different times in my life. There's just something comforting about knowing that He is with us in the darkest times of our lives. Then there's the third promise. It's the promise of exaltation And if you're reading this passage, look down at verses 5 and 6. Because King David says, God, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand this verse. God isn't talking about forcing you to share a meal with your enemies. The last thing that any of us want to do is to actually sit down to eat with someone that we don't trust, someone that hates us, someone who means harm to us. That's not what David is talking about. See, in his culture, when they had a banquet, the guest of honor always sat at the head table. That's what he's referring to. Right there in front of your biggest enemy, whatever that might be, whomever that might be, God says, come up here and sit with me. And then on top of everything else, while everybody else is watching, he anoints our heads with oil. Now, in the Bible, that's a sign of God's favor. That's a sign of God's choosing us. And then the psalmist talks about goodness and mercy following him all the days of his life. That's God's favor. And then he says, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. God's favor. I love that verse. That's exaltation. Because when he says, I'll dwell in the house of the Lord, that's God inviting us to settle down with him. I know you've probably got some friends, and when you walk into their house, you feel comfortable just kicking off your shoes and putting your feet up on the coffee table and just relaxing and spending time with them. That's what he's talking about here. We're so comfortable with God because we know that he is the good shepherd. Now, I want you to understand something. These three promises were made 3,000 years ago, but I believe they're as relevant today as they've ever been. I want to give you an opportunity today, a new opportunity. Our prayer team at First Baptist Church Dadeville has asked me to let you know that if you need prayer for any reason, you can send a text message. Yes, a text message to 256 496 6537. That's 256 496 6537. You send that prayer request and you can ask a member of the prayer team. They'll call you and pray with you. Or you can just leave your prayer request through the text message and they'll pray about that. But I want you to know that at First Baptist Church Dadeville, we love you. And we know God has promised to do good things for those who follow him. Have a great day.